we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like, oh yeah, somebody's yard looks like a skating rink. Here in Kentucky, we're preparing for an ice storm. So I'm hoping that my yard doesn't look like that skating rink later. It did remind me this morning about all the kids and families we serve and how that this is hard for us getting prepared, but it's really, really hard for families and young people in our rural areas that may not have everything that we can give to our kids. So it's great to be with you all today. I appreciate you taking the time to join us. I'm really excited for today's conversation. Over the last couple years, I've gotten to know Kirstin and Danielle really well as they've started doing this exciting work with Ascendium. And so I want to welcome them to join me. And Kirstin, Danielle, just introduce yourselves and talk about why rural is important to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself. And you can decide who goes first. Actually, Kirstin, you unmuted first. You want to go first?
Sure. Thanks so much, Dreama. Thanks so much for inviting us to be part of the conversation. We are really excited about the work that we are doing, and we're really looking forward to sharing it with you and with the others who are joining us today. My name is Kirstin Yeado. I'm a program officer at Ascendium Education Group, where I work on our relatively new rural post-secondary education and workforce training focus area. I've been at Ascendium for about 3 years, and I'm really excited to be working very closely with Danielle, my teammate and colleague in this work. I came to Ascendium because I truly believe in the power of post-secondary education to transform the lives of individuals, particularly those who are impacted by poverty. I've seen the impact of post-secondary education in my own family and in the work that I've done throughout my career. And I come to this work with a few different lenses and experiences. So prior to my time at Ascendium, I spent several years doing collective impact and community development work in communities throughout the country focused on improving academic outcomes for young people. I had the chance to do work in both rural and urban communities and quickly learned a lot about the importance of collaboration and relationships and how it's really built into the fabric of rural communities in particular. So I've taken a lot of those lessons learned and applied it to my work at Ascendium. When I first came here, I worked on an initiative that provided support to tribal colleges throughout the country. That really challenged me to think about the way that I define rural, and that has continued to shape the way that I think about collaboration and supports in our work at Ascendium. So in my role today, I'm really excited to be supporting and learning with and from a phenomenal group of partners who are committed to advancing post-secondary success for low-income rural learners throughout the country. I will hand it over to my colleague, Danielle, for her to introduce herself.
Thanks so much, Kirstin. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the chance to talk about rural and what excites us about our work. We know you're busy, and we know that everyone's calling in on a particularly cold and icy day. As someone that grew up playing pond hockey with my family, I can say with firm confidence that ice is a lot more fun as a child than as an adult. So I hope that we can all stay warm and safe. I joined Ascendium in October of 2019, and my role as a senior program officer, I have the pleasure of working alongside Kirstin to work with our network of partners across the United States to find creative and innovative and partnership-driven ways to support rural learners and their success when we think about education and workforce training. Prior to joining Ascendium, I spent 6 years working for Cummins, the global manufacturing company, maker of diesel engines, power generators, and all the pieces of technology that make both of those equipment more environmentally friendly. I began my career at the organization managing the company's charitable spending, and then I pivoted over to join the human resources leadership team where I worked on workforce development and pipeline planning. So put another way, how do you build a workforce that is both technically qualified, but representative of the markets that you're working in across the world? And most manufacturing towns and talents were in small remote communities. Prior to that, graduate school, and I began my career working at Kaboom, the national nonprofit dedicated to saving play. And so I spent my time there on the policy team working with mayors of all cities, large and small. And so most of my career has been built in the business of partnerships and finding ways that companies can collaborate with community-based organizations, can collaborate with higher ed to build stronger and more resilient communities. And so that's Kirsten and I. I'm calling in today from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and thanks so much for the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the work that we're doing. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing it. And it's interesting, you know, that relationships and partnerships and workforce. And I can see why you guys are doing the work you do, because I do think that when you work in rural places, it really is about relationships and connecting. And post-secondary is really tied to career, right? I mean, that's why we do post-secondary. And I think sometimes people forget that, right? They think that's the goal, but actually the goal is a workforce in our rural places. So I want to turn it over to you guys to share a little bit about the work. And if folks have questions, they can put them in the chat, but there'll be a time at the end that we can do some Q&A at the end also. So I think you have the power to share your screen. And so I'll just hand it over to you guys.
Great, thanks so much. We'll give just a second for the slides to load, and then we'll dive in. We'll talk a little bit about Ascendium, a little bit about our grant-making work as an organization. Then I'll turn it over to Kirsten to talk a little bit more about the work that we're doing specifically in rural communities across the United States. So Ascendium Education Group is a national nonprofit whose goal is to create partnerships that allow access to post-secondary education and workforce training for learners from low-income backgrounds. Dreama, exactly what you just talked about, the importance of education for community resiliency, for stronger relationships, and for a better future is really at the heart of all of our work that we do. It's particularly important in rural communities, but we have colleagues that are working and thinking about supporting learners from all types of backgrounds that have traditionally been underrepresented in post-secondary education. These include learners of color, incarcerated adults, first-generation students, veterans, as well as rural community members. So we're working nationally to build partnerships to help advance opportunity for these populations of learners. We have 4 focus areas for our grant making. The first is removing structural barriers. So how do you create policies and practices on a college campus that allow opportunity for students to not just enroll in post-secondary education training programs, but to successfully complete them and then enter the workforce? We have a team thinking about streamlining key learner transitions. And so they ask questions like, how do you make a connection between a 2-year institution and a 4-year institution? Or if you're an adult learner interested in pursuing some type of post-secondary education or training, how do you re-enter the post-secondary education system? And what do those successful on-ramps look like? We have colleagues thinking about creating opportunity for incarcerated adults by providing high quality post-secondary training programs in prisons across the United States. Then Kirsten and I round out the focus areas, focus on supporting rural education and workforce training. In 2019, Ascendium released our new grant-making strategy, which introduced these 4 focus areas. There were a couple other changes that happened that really, I'd say, started our learning journey, deepening into this space. The first was we went from focused on a 7-state geography in the Midwest to now working nationally, which means we have a network of partners working from coast to coast, including the islands of Puerto Rico, as well as the U.S. Pacific Islands and territories. We really try to build connection points intentionally between these 4 focus areas. We found that investing and thinking about rural community members creates opportunities not just for rural students, but for students from all types of backgrounds, because what we're seeking to do is to give post-secondary providers the tools to successfully work with students, give them what they need to be successful, and then complete education in a way that allows students to be competitive and compete for jobs that are in demand, jobs that are growing, and jobs that are not just a first entry to the workforce, but really set learners up for success across the course of their entire career. So I'll turn it over to Kirsten to talk a little bit more deeply about our work in our rural space. So we have 3 high-level priorities when it comes to our grant making, focused on bolstering our relationships in rural communities. The first is investing in high quality research to better understand rural learners and post-secondary providers. The overwhelming majority body of data that talks about learners has been targeted and tested on urban and suburban learners. When it comes to understanding what makes rural students successful, what do institutions need to do to help provide effective supports? And what is the rural student's journey, and how can we as a philanthropist and how can our partners help advance students along that way? We know that research is really the core and an underlying principle for advancing success. So we have some opportunities that we'll talk about a bit later in the presentation about how we're tackling supporting research in this space. The second is building capacity of post-secondary providers to support rural learners through their post-secondary experience and entry to the workforce. Rural post-secondary providers are often at the heart of rural communities. These are gathering spaces. These are opportunities to talk through big ideas. These are often the largest employers in an area and play an outsized role when it comes to preparing the future workforce. And we know that investments in post-secondary education and training are investments in stronger rural communities, investments in community resiliency. And so we want to build and bolster these institutions that have been historically serving and will continue to serve rural learners. This is particularly important as we keep an eye towards recovering from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis. Finally, Dreama, you said it best, we're investing in partnerships. We know that cross-sector collaboration is the key and at the heart of what really makes innovation, entrepreneurship, and any new idea successful in a rural community. We also know that there are very few tables that are set for rural leaders to come together and talk about the issues that are facing in their communities, the opportunities that come from working in a rural context, as well as what best practice means for supporting and understanding the communities that we all work in and are so passionate about supporting. And so when we take these three together, high quality research, capacity building, and catalyzing investments, that's pretty much a high-level overview of how we have been building and stewarding investment priorities over the past year and a half since we've begun this work. Now I'll turn it over to Kirstin to talk through some of the data and some of the broader questions that we're asking as a team.
Thanks so much, Danielle, and thanks everybody for your patience with our PowerPoint slides, which are loading a little bit slower than we anticipated this morning. Thanks, Danielle, for setting that up. I will share just a little bit more about how we came to define our rural focus area and talk a little bit more about what we mean by that. So we intentionally made the decision to invest in rural places, and this decision was guided and informed by data. I'm going to highlight a few of those data points here, most of which are likely not new to this audience joining us this morning. So we know that 20% of Americans live in a rural community. That is 1 in 5 Americans. And we know that 41 million Americans live in education deserts, which means there is not a college or a university within 25 miles, or that there's a single community college that serves as the only broad access public institution within 25 miles. That context is really important as we look at data about who is actually enrolling in college. So if you look at enrollment data, we see that only 50% of 18 to 24-year-olds from urban communities are enrolled in a post-secondary program, compared to only 30% of individuals of the same age from rural communities. Not surprisingly, these disparities persist as we look at credential attainment data. We see that 42% of urban leaders have an associate's or higher, compared to 29% of rural learners. We know that ultimately this leads to a shortage of skilled workers, which impacts the economic health of both families and communities. And at Ascendium, we believe that post-secondary education has the potential to dramatically impact the lives of learners, particularly those from low-income backgrounds. So if we or any funder are serious about post-secondary success for all, we cannot ignore the 20% or 1 in 5 of Americans who live in rural communities, which have so often been overlooked when it comes to funding and resources. So a question that you might be asking at this point is, what do we mean by rural? Our driving focus at Ascendium is all about supporting post-secondary education institutions that are located in rural communities and who are serving students from rural communities. Simply put, we quickly learned that there is not an easy way to define rural, and that rural is often defined by what it is not, urban or suburban, and not actually for what it is. The federal government alone has several ways of defining rural, and most often rural is simply defined as being non-metro. To date, we have used census data and other key data sources like the USDA's Rural Urban Continuum codes to help us define what we mean when we say rural. And we've really looked to our grant partners to help us understand and explore why or why not they may see themselves as rural. We know that rurality does not neatly fall within county or state lines. And so using some of these data sources is really tough. That is why we have enlisted the help of some key partners to help us in that work. So you see a few of those partners listed here on this slide. First, we're working with a team at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to help us identify institutions that are rural located and serving rural learners. We're also working with a team of researchers from the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges, which includes institutions like Appalachian State, who are helping us to think about what it means to be a rural serving institution. So you may have an institution that's technically in a metro area, but is largely serving a rural geography. We're really eager to work with these partners over the coming months to help us refine our way of thinking about rural and what that means for our grant making moving forward. And I am going to take down the slides now so that hopefully you can see all of us as we continue this conversation.
So I think it's really interesting, and I'm glad that you're digging into the rural serving versus the rural location, right? Because I do think that's something that most folks haven't connected into and thought deeply about. What sort of put you on that path? What was the aha that had you start thinking about that distinction and that and digging into that? And I know I'm going off script, but I'm just curious. So I'm just going to ask the questions I'm curious about.
I think there were a few things, Dreama. There's the data that Kirstin talked about when it comes to student outcomes and opportunity. I think philanthropy as a field has also largely ignored and underinvested in rural communities. This is particularly true for larger grant-making organizations that might have a specific issue or focus area. There's, of course, a vast network of United Ways, community foundations, family foundations that have been historically investing in rural places and spaces. But our board of directors, many of whom grew up in small towns, worked in small towns, led small businesses and opportunities, found that only 5% of philanthropic dollars end up in rural zip codes. And so as we started to think about the students that we wanted to serve, the opportunity to tackle inequities in the higher education system, as well as the opportunity to work with a new network of partners and a new network of post-secondary providers, were some of the reasons that started our organizational investment in this space.
And I know you spent quite a bit of time thinking about the strategy and engaging lots of folks. So tell us a little bit about that process. And I know that's how we met, is through some of those just conversations as you all were thinking about the strategy.
Yeah, it was. It's funny that there were multiple roads that led back to Dreama and Berea. It was really important for us to have a strategy that was reflective and responsive, not just as what we thought as an organization might be interesting or additive to the field, but what the field and practitioners themselves thought would be important. So Kirstin and I were very lucky. We had a 6-month period where we were able to work together and canvass the field to ask 3 important questions. 1, what are the most important things that we need to know and understand about rural learners? Second, what are the needs of post-secondary providers that are serving these learners? And third, how could we as a national philanthropy support and catalyze and advance a lot of the great work that was already happening, as well as providing opportunities for different types of work that it would be newer to the rural space. So we ended up talking to over 115 community leaders. And so these were folks that worked in community colleges, elected officials, community foundation leaders, Dreama and your team, as well as students themselves to help answer those questions. we took the results from all of those interviews as well as some research that we did to go through and identify the most important grant-making priorities, which were the ones that we started talking about a bit earlier. I do want to define two key terms that we've been talking about and using through this discussion. So the first is post-secondary provider. So we use that term as an acknowledgement to the fact that we partner not just with 2 or 4 year traditional post-secondary providers, but as well as alternative credentials to understanding what workforce training might be, apprenticeship training programs, micro-credentialing, work-based training programs. We see lots of different options available to learners and want to support all of them in our grant making and the way that we steward partnerships. The second is a very intentional framing that Kirsten and I take to the work on highlighting the assets that comes from rural communities. For the last 100+ years, it's not an exaggeration to say that the national narrative for post-secondary education is that rural means less than. Rural means unprepared. Rural means lack of opportunity. And we know that that's not the case. We know it from our talented network of partners, and we know it from what we're learning along the way. And so going through that process of understanding what's happening in the field and having a grant making strategy that was responsive to those identified needs was how we started this work and how we've continued to iterate and improve moving forward. We're aware that we likely didn't get everything correct on the first try, and that's okay. We're solving really big, complicated questions about the future of communities, which makes this work simultaneously exciting, but also need for flexibility and really, really being responsive to our partners as they talk about what's most important in their communities and how we can help support their goals.
And what occurred to me as you were talking about that process is I know that some of the folks that are listening today are running college access programs or running programs in schools, right? And so that's the exact same process that they do to design their programs in their schools. Listen to the students, listen to the stakeholders, listen to the community, bring all that together and have that asset frame. So I think it's really cool that you guys use that frame as funders, thinking on a broader scale, because it really is about that asset base, right? Of realizing what is unique to rural and what are the assets that can be capitalized on. The other piece that resonates for us, that those folks doing college access, is the importance of research. And we know that doing our work, and especially if we're funded by federal grants and even private philanthropy, they're looking for research-based practices. And we've always struggled because there's not a lot of research done in rural places. So can you talk to me a little bit about why you gave research a priority and what that's looking like?
Yeah, so Danielle noted that when we were developing our strategy, we spoke with over 100 individuals, researchers, practitioners, folks leading organizations, institutions on the ground in rural communities. One of the things that we heard over and over again is exactly what you alluded to, Dreama, that there just is a total lack of research about rural post-secondary education, whether we're talking about rural learners themselves or institutions. And so we realized that in order to truly understand how to target our investments and really make an impact, that there was a lot that we needed to know about what's working and what's not. So to get at that information, we have engaged a group of researchers and practitioners who are working in and for rural post-secondary education, who are helping us to develop a rural research agenda. It would have been really easy for Danielle and I to sit and put together a list of questions that we think are most important to be answered. But we have very intentionally engaged a diverse group of individuals working in rural spaces throughout the country, because we know that rural looks different in different places. And we want this group to help us make sure that we are prioritizing the right questions and asking the questions that will lead to action on the ground. And that last piece around action is really essential to us. So we want to make sure that the questions we're asking in the research that we would fund is really going to inform the work that you and your partners are doing every day. I like research, I like data. We don't want to fund research just for the sake of, putting research in journals. That's all great and important, but we want it to be acted on. And so I think some examples of, potential ways that we see this agenda shaping up. So we know right now, for example, that students are learning online because of COVID, and we know that many rural communities lack access to broadband, and institutions have been getting really creative in how they adapt and the opportunities that they're providing for students. And there's a real opportunity to learn about the promising models and practices that are being implemented in this time and how that can inform future work. So really digging into that could be a potential way that we utilize the research, and I think could be really informative for post-secondary institutions or organizations working on the ground. We've also heard many rural institutions talk about their struggles to attract and retain staff. We want to better know what's working, what's not, what are the promising practices that institutions are employing to keep talent, how can that be shared and replicated, who's doing this well? Those are all sorts of questions that we think could really be actionable for folks on the ground. Another question that comes up for us quite frequently: what are the most essential supports for rural learners who are attending college? What are the supports that can help eliminate those disparities that we referenced earlier? Where are those supports working? How can they be replicated? What are the different funding streams that rural communities are tapping into to both implement and sustain them? We also have a lot of questions about the narrative around the importance of post-secondary education. We're currently working with the Education Commission of the States on some survey work to help us better understand how rural residents value post-secondary education and the barriers that they encounter. So for individuals who work with high school students or college students, that type of information is critical to informing the way that you might talk to students about post-secondary education at the post-secondary level and the types of supports that you think about implementing to support students on their path into college. And then, of course, once they're there, the supports that they need to promote their success. And that type of information, while valuable at the individual level, kind of also informs broader policy and systems change work that is essential to supporting students as well. So there's a lot that we're really excited about, and we're really excited to have a group of researchers and practitioners that will help to inform the development of that agenda. Once it's completed later this summer, we anticipate that this will be a guiding document that informs the future investments that we make at Ascendium. But I also want to be clear that it's not just a document for Ascendium, that this research agenda is something that we plan to share broadly, and we hope that it's something that will spark learning and action among other funders and partners committed to this work as well.
I think I'm so excited you're doing that because it is so needed, and especially the way you're taking the researcher and the practitioner, both of those voices together, because I think that's going to make it relevant. Because I think we can all look back in the past at research that was done and then just sat on the shelf. So I know you're looking at the end of the summer having this agenda here. Do you envision opportunities for practitioners to chime in or to hear about it? What's your dissemination plan, or how can people engage? Like if somebody's been doing something or has, if we have young researchers or old researchers, be any age of a researcher on the line that's interested, how can they engage with you?
We do have a plan for funding opportunities to be released in connection with the research agenda later this year. What and how those are shaped up and looked like are still to be determined, but the best way to keep in touch would be visiting our website and subscribing to the Ascendium newsletter. That's the primary way that we communicate future opportunities. But absolutely, Dreama, that's the goal. We're here today talking about conversations for action, and so that's our plan to take field input, ideas with this agenda, and then opportunities and resources to then go out and answer these critical questions that we hope will be elevated and highlighted.
And I think I was asking more about like the field input. Is there going to be opportunities just for input into the agenda? Not necessarily the funding of research, but just the if people have ideas or if they want to talk.
Sure, great clarifying question. So we are relying primarily on our partnership with SOVA Solutions, who has two main groups that are providing input to this. The first is the group of researchers that Kirstin mentioned, and then we have a second advisory group of practitioners that has been stood up that will be the two primary groups that are shaping the agenda. I'm not sure if we'll have opportunities for engagement from the field beyond that. That's something that we'll have to check with our partners and follow back up with.
I think it's really going to help us as practitioners in rural places, especially as we compete for federal grants where we have to show research and we have to do that. So I think that's going to be a real actionable piece of this. So we've talked about the research. Is there other investments or other partnerships that you've made or things that are in the process that you want to, share, like other cool things you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say that the coolest things that we're doing are coming from our network of partners. So I'd love to chance to talk about kind of 3 types of groups of partners that we have going. So we do have a full list of our partners available on our website. So if anyone is curious or wants to learn a little bit more information, I'd point you there. But in general, Ascendium's philanthropy seeks to drive change at the systems level. So this means that our investments aren't often with one individual program or one individual institution. Rather, we work with groups of colleges and post-secondary providers, larger intermediaries that are providing support to those institutions, as well as community-based organizations that are working across different geographies and leverage those relationships. So we have some partners that are focused pretty squarely in the workforce development and training place. A couple of examples, we have a partnership with the organization Digital Promise that's going to be looking at micro-credentials across rural America. What micro-credentials are available? How easy is it to access them? And how are they connected with the labor needs of different geographies? We have a partnership with the Center on Rural Innovation that's going to be looking at how rural communities can prepare to dive in and create entry points to the digital economy. How do we need to work with community colleges and employers and different workforce development entities to help make that opportunity possible, since we know that tech jobs are some of the fastest growing and highest wage earning jobs that will be available in the future. Another really interesting partnership is the work that we do with Rural LISC. And LISC is an acronym that stands for the Local Initiative Support Corporation. And they have a great program called Rural Works. And so this is a national network of cities and workforce development partners that are all coming together to answer the question, what does it mean to provide high quality job training in rural places? How can you take advantage of relationships and some other non-institutional based training programs? And so that network of practitioners has been really insightful for us as we understand and think about building relationships beyond traditional academic institutions. We do have some partners that are focused pretty traditionally on engaging in particular community colleges, since we know that that's often the first inroad for rural learners when they think about post-secondary education. The folks at the National Center for Inquiry and Improvement, NCII, have a learning community of 25 rural community college presidents that have been coming together over the past 6 months to talk about how do we prepare as community colleges to not just get through the COVID-19 period, but to succeed beyond it. And what does it mean to serve students in this particularly complex and trying time? What do we need to know if you're a rural community college leader, and what are some of the trends in the future? We have a relationship with the Education Design Lab, which is engaging a network of 5 community colleges through their Bridges program. So really at the heart of that learning community is answering the question, how can rural community colleges be an economic engine for the rural locations that they serve? And how can we learn from each other in ways that center design experiences that really take student voice when identifying future learning opportunities? We also have partners that are thinking really exclusively about equity and the role of race when it comes to student success in rural communities. Say there's a bit of a misnomer or a myth that rural equals white, and we know that that's not the case. In fact, some of the fastest growth of populations of colors in the United States is happening in rural communities. So we really have been learning a lot from organizations like Excellencia in Education. They're looking at rural institutions that are based in Puerto Rico to understand what does it mean when we think about resiliency. This is a geography that has had to deal with economic stagnation, changing labor force, as well as natural disasters. And we think there's a lot of innovation that comes from the way that these organizations have operated and served their students. We also have a partnership with APIA Scholars, that's Asian and Pacific Islander American Scholars, And they completed some really interesting research last year that looked at Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders in rural island communities. There's a really intentional set of student supports that could be tailored to help better make sure that these students are, again, not just enrolling on campus, but completing their educational journey. And while we might be asking these questions in one specific geography or in a couple of specific communities, they have implications across the entire country in the way that we think about supporting learners of color in rural places and spaces. And so one thing that we really like and appreciate about our partners is that they are creative. They are great at building partnerships with stakeholders as well as other partners in our portfolio. And all of them have lived and learned experience working and engaging with rural spaces. Rurality is center to the way that their organizations think about the future of student service. And that's something that we think makes this quite a special group of individuals that we have the pleasure to work with.
So I was just taking real quick notes as you were going through that, because I was like, are they doing anything in this area or this? And you mentioned the racial equity piece. And one of the things that I get asked a lot as I work nationally in rural places is there is this this thought that rural might be code for white, and really 1 in 5 rural learners is a person of color. So any early thoughts or did, I guess what I want to ask is, this with the murder of George Floyd, right? And this racial justice movement we're finally seeing in this country, has that influenced the agenda, or are you thinking of this context?
I think like a lot of things in the last year, Dreama, it absolutely influenced and I think accelerated the way that not just we, but our network of partners were thinking about the need for lasting change. To take a non-racial example, conversations of folks that have worked in rural, broadband's been center. You can't have a conversation about rural education without broadband, but now that we have all transitioned to e-learning, that's suddenly become a national conversation for change. We've seen similar trends in the way that both our partners as well as students have talked about, thought about, and demanded change when it comes to racial equity. There's a whole growing body of data that talks about ways that we can accelerate and enhance learning opportunities for students of color, but it requires change. It requires looking and evaluating success a little bit differently, and it requires not just one person on a campus or in an organization to be advocating for change, but really broad support through the entire organization. And so we feel lucky to have a network of partners that have centered that in the way that they think about students, in the way that they think about change, and the way that they recommend lasting to changes and interventions for supporting this body of students. So in a lot of ways, Dreama, it's changed everything, and we hope that it continues to change everything because we can't keep operating as a field in the way that we have been operating. And so that's really, I'd say, the call to action that we've centered in our work and in the way that we've built partnerships. Kirstin, I'm not sure if you have anything you want to add or reflect on that question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Dreama, and I think entirely agree with what Danielle shared in that it has shaped everything in the way that we are approaching this work. I am a big believer, and Ascendium really values using data and thinking about the data as a flashlight, right, to guide where we want to go. And I can't recall the specific statistic off the top of my head at the moment, but individuals of color are one of the fastest growing populations in rural communities. And I think that is something that we need to lift up as we talk about the narrative of what rural means, who lives in rural communities, and then the types of solutions or strategies that we need to invest in order to support rural communities and the different needs that exist throughout the country. So using that data as a flashlight to really guide and understand and shape the narrative of rural, I think is something that we're very, very cognizant of and want to think thoughtfully about as we go forward in our work, and particularly with the research agenda in the coming year.
And I love that, and that data is that flashlight. And I think, I will speak sort of from the Partners for Education perspective, and we do our work in Appalachian, Kentucky, which is predominantly white. What we finally did at the beginning of the year. And I think it really took that acceleration and that crisis to force us to really take that flashlight and look at the data of African-American students in our footprint. And I'm doing this off the top of my head, but around 1% of the students cradle to career within our footprint are African-American. But when you look at their outcomes from K readiness through academic achievement through high school graduation, they're lagging behind white students in every indicator, right? And so I think that for us, it really forced us to think we're not going to be satisfied until every student is achieving, right? And so we have to consider racial equity. And yesterday I was looking through a survey of, we have 1,900 students that are seniors in this cluster of counties in Appalachian, Kentucky, and 500 of them completed a survey, which is a great return rate. And one of the qualitative questions we asked them was that sort of what keeps you up at night. And this survey was done during the pandemic. And their comments included things like racial equity, right? And homophobia and bullying, right? And so I do think that the young people in our places in rural America are really aware of this the world perspective. And this equity is important to them. And we've seen that. And so I'm really excited that you are focusing that flashlight on some of the equity issues within rural places. And I do think that it's a narrative, right? I know I'm rambling, so I'm going to get us back on script, but I go down these rabbit holes because I'm passionate about some of these things. So one of the things that I'm hearing is that data is important. Is there thoughts on shaping sort of that narrative, using data to shape this narrative of post-secondary workforce in rural places? Is there, because there's a story to be told once you start doing this research and looking at this data.
Absolutely, Dreama, and that's one of the things that I'm most excited about that our partners are going to be sharing over the next 6 months. Kirsten said it really well at the beginning of this presentation. Rural places and rural learners are often defined as what they are not rather than what they are. So the opportunity to say with data, with clarity, with mapping, here's the population of learners that we're seeking to impact. Here's what their educational journey looks like. Here's ways that they can be supported, and here's barriers that you can help overcome, is an incredibly powerful way to think about the future of serving rural students. I also think data can help to rebuke some of the broader national narratives of divisiveness between urban spaces and rural spaces. And the opportunity to do that is one that I think has implications not just for the field of education, but for the field of economic development, for health, for rurality and resiliency. There's just so many different ways to connect in this body of data to all of the issues that you think about, that folks on the phone are thinking about. It's something that really excites us, particularly as we pivot to a hopefully post-COVID world.
And one last question around sort of the pandemic and COVID-19. How did you pivot? What were some of the pivots that you all had to make as an organization as you were thinking about this and your work this year?
Yeah, I'd say there were a few things that we had to keep in mind. The first was easing administrative burdens from our partners. How could we ease up some of our reporting and some of our other ways that we work with our partners on a regular basis so they had flexibility to pivot the work that they were doing to be responsive to the moment. As an organization, Ascendium had a series of grants to our partners as well as larger intermediaries that were targeted at supporting institutions that served primarily students from low-income backgrounds, open access institutions. And we had a series of COVID-19 related grants that were specifically targeted to the moment. I'd say the final change and shift is that Kirsten and I have been very intentional with our time to build in space for continual feedback. We're on the phone a lot with practitioners. We're asking a lot of questions of our partners to understand what are the needs of students in this current moment, what are the needs of institutions in this current moment, and how can we be an effective partner as everyone is doing not just one or two jobs, but the whole series of hats that we all have to wear working. And I think the fact that we're talking right now from my home to yours is indicative of that shift, but also the reality that we're working in now. So it's been changes all across the board.
And I do appreciate that flexibility, right? I think that's critical. And I was thinking about how we're working now. And I have one, my kids are almost grown, right? And I'm thinking, how would I have done this if they had been 4 and 5 years old? That would have been, and I have people that work with me every day dealing with that. But that also reminds me of folks trying to go through college and post-secondary with children and working full time. Is that an area that you are looking at too? Is that how in rural places, many of our post-secondary students are also parents?
Absolutely. I think that our colleagues at the ECMC Foundation have published a whole broad series of data and information elevating the importance of focusing on single mothers and campuses. We also know just by the data that we referenced earlier, community colleges are most often the on-ramps for rural learners when it comes to post-secondary provider. And there's an incredible amount of both learners from low-income backgrounds as well as single parents, as well as adults re-entering and retraining. The reality is that we have the most diverse workforce that we have ever had. There are 5 generations that are currently working and training and leading. And community colleges really center service of these, I guess, post-traditional students is the term that you'll see throughout reports in academia. So those are absolutely learners that are centered in our goals and who we want to serve.
And I'm really hoping that this experience of so many of us working at home will make us more empathetic and broaden our perspective of how we need to create nurturing environments for those young people that we're serving, and realize that there are these, we're whole people and we bring all of this in, just like our students bring all of this in. So it's been a really interesting learning piece for me to start to understand more what other folks have had to deal with.
Absolutely.
So we're close to our time here. So to close out, what's exciting you about this next year? What are you looking forward to in the work? And let's not even do a year, because Lord knows with the pandemic, things change. So let's do the next 6 months. What's really exciting you when you think of the work that you're doing and the contribution you're making in the next 6 months?
There's a lot of things that I think are really exciting, Dreama, and as always, this conversation I think has underscored just a lot of the reasons that we're in this work and a lot of the reasons why we're really excited. I think, so there's 2 things that I think come to mind, and one is just the opportunity to really lift up and center rural communities. You know, we've talked about lifting up and centering the data, talking about the narrative. We have spent so much of our time over the past year, as Danielle noted, talking with people and trying to get a better understanding of what the assets are in rural communities, what the challenges are. And I'm just really excited about the opportunity to kind of share, lift up, and center what's happening in rural communities and ensure that given our platform, we're able to talk about the importance of investment in rural communities as essential to the work that we're doing nationally. Over the summer, we'll have a lot more data about how rural communities perceive education, what the barriers are. We'll have some really interesting work coming out of our partners who are working on defining rural. We'll have this research agenda, and we are really excited to sort of hit the pavement and share this with partners throughout the field and to really lift up what the potential investment opportunities could be. I think the other big thing that I think about that really excites me in this work every day, and I mentioned it earlier, is really just about collaboration. And before my time at Ascendium, I mentioned my experience in community development and collective impact. And I've learned a lot about collaboration and how it's really essential to getting the work done. And that's a lens and frame that we absolutely bring to our work at Ascendium. So as a funder that works nationally, we're committed to solving some really tough and complex challenges and know that we need to work with communities and with partners who are trying to tackle them. There's a lot that we can share, but there's also a lot that we have to learn. And so we're really excited about the opportunity to collaborate with folks along that journey. Danielle, what would you add?
That was a darn near perfect answer, Kirsten. I don't have much. I'm just continually excited about the stories that we'll be able to tell with this data and with this information, and the opportunity to move beyond data points into talking about real humans. We're in this very, very unique moment over the next 6 months as we think about pandemic recovery, a transition in administration, and ongoing need to support and reskill the hundreds of thousands of workers across the United States that are going to need tools to advance their career, tools to serve their community, and tools to continue to grow their ongoing educational journey. And we have some partners that have really creative ideas on how that could happen. And so I'm looking forward to learning from them, seeing what they can accomplish and supporting them along the way.
And I'll answer too, because I can answer too. What excites me about this and the work that you all are doing is I do think, and this is building some on what you said, Danielle, is that this pandemic has shown that lots of different types of work can happen in a virtual environment. And when I think of Appalachian Kentucky and I think of other geographically isolated places, if we can crack that broadband issue, then telework at all levels of income and types of jobs should be able to really come into our places so that our young people graduating won't have to leave in order to do a job that feeds their passion, right? So I think we have this opportunity over this next 6 months and this next year to reframe what work looks like and how that work can happen, right? We can all work from our living room, right? There's many jobs we've learned that people can do from their living room. So that's one of the things that excites me. Thank you guys for joining us. I can't wait to get back together this time next year after you've got your agenda, you've started doing it. So we'll do that. I'm running out of time. So let's pull up a couple slides, Sam. Our March webinar, and Sam will put the date up for that, is March 10th. And we're actually going to use that as a preview to our College Access and Success Summit. We are going live, virtual live, not in-person live for the summit. It'll be a week. We're going to be together 12:30 to 3:30 every day. Each day we'll have a keynote and some breakout sessions and that kind of thing. So we're going to preview the summit in March so that you can start thinking about what sessions and what you're interested in. We'll be sending an email out after today's webinar that has a link to the slides that Kirstin and Danielle showed, and also the link to register for the summit. Our goal for the summit is to get as many people as possible engaged in the learning piece. So we do have a structure this time that organizations do one registration and they can send as many folks as they want. And that if you're an individual not affiliated with an organization, but you're in a rural place, you actually can register for free. So the goal really is to get this learning opportunity to as many people as possible. Our next slide, So this is just another prettier slide. I'm excited that Silas House and Neela Vaswani are our first keynote on the first day. They're authors and they've written about sort of the rural and urban connection through some books they've done, and Silas writes regularly for The Atlantic. And so it'll be nice to kick it off with them. So we're looking forward to March doing a preview of the summit, and then in April we'll have our summit week. And Danielle and Kirstin, I'm hoping you guys can participate in the summit. You guys were there. You all were planning for it with us for Arizona and we had to cancel, right? So next year we'll be together in Arizona. So thanks everybody. We will get all the data slides out. We'll send the deck out and the link to the summit. So Danielle, Kirstin, anything else you'd like to add before we sign off?
Just to thank you for the opportunity, Dreama, and everyone that joined in today. We know you're busy. We know you have lots of priorities. And so thank you both for joining today, but also for all the work that you do year round when you're not on a conference call with us to support rural learners and students. It's important work. It is the work of the future. And we just really, really value your time, your expertise, and the energy that you put towards serving these students.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, guys. I'll be talking to you all soon, and we'll see everybody else in March. We'll be preview our summit. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Bye.